الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. The people who became specialists in the deen, who went to like religious schools and so forth, in general this group was made up of the worst students in the society. In other words, in many places, basically it was, if you cannot get into the more important schools, the more important subjects, if you cannot get into, for example, engineering or sciences and so forth, then you're stuck with either Arabic literature or the deen. So what happens is you get people who study the deen, and because they study the deen and because they got some kind of degree, they are respected as the scholars of the deen. But the people with the best minds in the society, the people who could really think, who really had the mental faculties, they were all pushed into other sciences and other areas. And these are the people that we really need to analyze the situation of the Muslim Ummah, to analyze events and know how to react to them in the proper Islamic way. And in fiqh, especially the fiqh of like what we could call current events, or know how to behave under different circumstances, this requires an academic background, real mental faculties to be able to understand and analyze and come to a conclusion. Fiqh is not just memorizing text and being able to spit out the text when you are asked about something. But fiqh actually requires that people have the ability to understand phenomena, whether it's economic phenomena or political phenomena, sociological phenomena. You have to first understand the concept itself. What is going on before you can make a fiqh conclusion. And so the best minds of the Muslim Ummah, they were pushed into other sciences, and the role of the deen and the role of the scholars, or the Islamic studies, these were left for those people who could not get into those other areas. And in addition to that also, in many of the schools also the place that was given to the religious studies. Maybe there'd be one course a day or one course a week, and it would always be like the last course, where everybody's exhausted and just want to get out. And the quality of the teacher usually also was not the best quality. So the whole system in many Muslim countries for the past 100 to 150 years was discouraging the real development of scholars, people who had in-depth knowledge and understanding such that they could lead the Muslims. And if you are lacking those kinds of scholars, or for some reason the scholars that are there are not trustworthy, or they're not willing to speak, you know, the famous quote from Imam Ahmed about whether or not the scholar can resort to tuqya. Yani that, for example, if the scholar is asked a question, does he have the right to resort to this principle that out of fear of some negative consequence and so forth, that he can lie and not say the truth? So Imam Ahmed's answer to that was, if the scholar resorts to tuqya and the ignorant is ignorant, when will the truth be told? And how is the truth going to be known if the scholars are not speaking? And you cannot expect the ignorant to know what is the truth. And if the scholars are fearful and not willing to speak, then when is the truth going to be spoken? And who is it who's going to come up and say the truth? And this is what has led to, for example, if we're talking, let's say in particular, the movement in Egypt. And by the way, the movement in Egypt, and why I stress that movement in Egypt is because it's also very relevant to the movement that still exists nowadays, the kind of extremist movements that exist nowadays. So when people don't have ulama, they turn to others like themselves who are ignorant like themselves, and they give fatwas for each other, and it's like the blind leading the blind. And what can you expect? You know, for example, some of these extremist movements in Egypt that developed in the prisons in Egypt, they have some of the same thinking as the Khawarij that we talked about. And when it was pointed out to them by other people in prison who had maybe a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more experience, who were trying to advise them and saying, look, you're going too far, they would tell them, your beliefs, these ideas that you're promoting are the same ideas that were promoted by the Khawarij way back when. And they had no clue who were the Khawarij. They never heard of them before. And they say, for example, if you go to a Shahrastani's book on the groups in Islam, you'll find the same arguments that you're making. And they said, you know, I've never heard of that book. One of them said, oh, I remember seeing that in the library somewhere. So if the scholars are not fulfilling their role, first of all, if you don't have the scholars and you're not developing the real scholars, and I think I touched upon that, this kind of importance of this in my lecture last night, so I'll not get into it here. But obviously, if you don't have the real scholars, and the real scholars are not willing to come out and speak and guide, then you don't have the people who will be able to see what are the extremes and what is the middle road that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it can be expected under circumstances like that people will fall into one extremism or another extremism. Most of the factors that I have been speaking about so far deals with internal situations within the Muslim Ummah. However, there's no question that the international arena, the international situation, is also greatly responsible or a great factor in the development and the spreading of extremist views among Muslims. You know, for example, if you go to what is quoted from bin Laden, for example. You know, after the attacks on the World Trade Center and all that stuff about, oh, they hate our freedoms and so forth. I don't know who came up with that, but that's... If you go, for example, to the people that they claim are the ones responsible, what are they talking about? They're talking about, for example, the situation in Palestine, the situation in Iraq, the military presence in, for example, in Saudi Arabia. Even bin Laden referred to the bombing of Hiroshima in Japan. What was that even and unfortunately Americans are not really into their own history. Unless you're talking about maybe the history of basketball and baseball and something like that. Otherwise they're not even the bombing, the dropping of the atomic bomb in Japan. It's well recognized by many American historians. The purpose of that was not to defeat the Japanese. Because the Japanese were already ready to surrender. They didn't need to drop those bombs in order for the war to come to an end. That's the official excuse that they give now. Oh, we dropped those bombs. Yes, we killed so many, hundreds of thousands, but it was for a good cause, to save so many other people from dying. But historians know that wasn't the case. The war was coming to an end. The Japanese were ready to surrender. Now, what's the theory of why they dropped the bomb? I will, if you want to read about that, you can read about it on your own. In general, I don't discuss political issues, details of political issues too much. And the reason I don't discuss it is there are a number of reasons. So let me just preface some of the points that I'm going to make by giving these these introductory points. One of the reasons, of course, is that there's so much that we as Muslims need to know about our own deen itself, that if you have a conflict of time, what are you going to spend your time on? It's much better for us Muslims to spend our time knowing and really understanding what our deen is telling us, and what it is we're supposed to believe, how we're supposed to behave, and so forth. And also, when it comes to political issues, it's very easy to go to an extreme. Extremists everywhere. It's very easy to go overboard. The general principles, especially of international politics and so forth, they are clear. Just even from the Qur'an and Sunnah, you can understand what is going on in the world. But it's very easy to go into detail and political issues, and that'll take up your whole time. And for example, the Arab-Israeli conflict, there's over 1,000 books written just here in the United States are available. And if you want to get into it and, say, oh, so-and-so said this on such and such date, and this could take up your whole life just studying this conflict. And I don't think there's any need for us in general to get, and this is not even to speak about the fact that now every day there's newspapers and the internet and all of that other information, that if you allow yourself to get too much involved in it, and it will be something that it'll cost you. It'll cost you in the sense that time that you're spending learning all that stuff, you could have been maybe learning just the basics of that and spending your other time learning things which are more important to you. Plus, and this is a very important point, and when you read about international politics and what is going on in the 20th century, what is going on in the 21st century, especially with respect to the Muslim Ummah and how the Muslim Ummah is being treated, unless you have some good understanding of the Qur'an and Sunnah, unless you have some basics of Iman in your heart, it is very easy to be overcome by these things such that it will drive you to do some acts or drive you to some positions which are extremist positions. And if you just concentrate on reading about these kind of things, and you do not have the proper imani kind of balance in your heart and in your mind, these kinds of things, if you read them, and if you're aware of what has happened to the Muslim Ummah by the kuffar, it can easily drive you to extremist positions, extreme acts. And it is really one of the major causes, and we have to recognize the fact, it is one of the major causes behind the extremism that exists in the Muslim world. So you cannot concentrate on studying those things unless you also concentrate on reading the Qur'an and remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to put that proper balance back into your heart, into your mind, that you see things, inshallah, in the correct way. However, at the same time, to some extent, I think it is important that we study some of these topics and we understand what is going on, because also our judgment of each other is sometimes colored by the fact that we are ignorant of certain facts that maybe others are well aware of. And we judge things based on what we know, and we make conclusions about others due to our lack of knowledge of certain things that have occurred. So we may take positions, we may have beliefs based on our lack of knowledge of some things that have occurred. And plus, in addition, someone once asked me, what's the point of, one time I lectured about some recent events in the Muslim world in the past century. And someone asked me, what's the point of that? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Qur'an, for example, وَلَن تَرْضَ عَنْكَ الْيَهُودُ وَلَا النَّصَارَى حَتَّى تَتَّبِعَ مِلَّتَهُمْ. Yani that the Jews and the Christians, they're not going to be pleased with you until you follow their way of life. And clear signs from the Qur'an. Yani, so we don't even need to discuss it. We know these facts already. But sometimes, as in the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, sometimes seeing is believing. I mean, if you know the facts, and you may think about those issues on a theoretical level, but when you actually see them and realize what is going on, your belief in what the Qur'an is telling you becomes firmer, and the reality of the Qur'an becomes very clear to you. And if, for example, in that point, there are many people, Muslims here in the United States, that cannot imagine that there's really any hatred between the Christians and Jews versus Islam, towards Islam. And also, finally, we have to make sure that we are not fooled by the kuffar also. To be put in situations where they deceive us about their acts, and we come to some conclusions which are not correct according to Qur'an and Sunnah. For example, there was a Young Republicans conference at the University of Oregon. If you ever want a source of humorous anecdotes, just watch a Young Republicans conference. So the speaker, it was a woman. She's a far right speaker. I forget. I can never remember her name. Anyway, this was shortly after September 11th. And so someone in the audience stood up and asked the question that, don't you think that American foreign policy has something to do with the existence of these terrorists and the acts that they perform? And so the woman, she answered that the last 2 wars that we've gone to have been on behalf of Muslims. And it seems like the Muslims are not getting the picture. The last 2 wars that America went to were on behalf of Muslims. Now or Muslims here in this country, they hear this kind of thing, they might be fooled by it. First of all, do you imagine that America is really going to go to war on behalf of Muslims, and that's going to be their real intent behind it? Similarly, in Newsweek magazine, one time they had this issue, I think they had something like the Qur'an on the cover. And they had an article in there, and also the author of that article, Christopher Dickey, he mentioned the fact that Americans defended Muslims against the likes of Saddam Hussein and Slobodan Milosevic was ignored because for Bin Laden's bloody-minded purposes, it had to be. So here again, they're trying to paint America as this great defender of Muslims. Defended Muslims from Saddam Hussein and defended Muslims from Milosevic. And these are the kind of issues that if you allow yourself just to listen to the mainstream media and so forth, you might be duped into believing that this is the case. That America is actually our friend, and they've come to our defense on many occasions. And I think if you take the time to analyze it a little bit closer, you'll find that maybe, in fact, what they're claiming is not true whatsoever. However, at the same time, I must emphasize the fact that we cannot put the blame for our problems, we cannot put all the blame for our problems on the disbelievers. As I talked about before, and the battle of Uhud, the defeat at the battle of Uhud was because of what we as Muslims did. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also in another place in the Qur'an reminds us, وَمَا أَصَابَكُم مِّن مُّصِيبَةٍ فَبِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِيكُمْ وَيَعْفُ عَنْ كَثِيرٍ. That any musibah, any affliction that afflicts you is the result of what your own hands have earned, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala overlooks a lot. And in other words, the afflictions that come to us as a Muslim ummah, is the result of our own actions. First and foremost, they are the result of our own actions. Our own turning away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our own ignorance of the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we can never put the blame of what occurs to us completely at the hands of the kuffar and say all of this is because of the kuffar. We have to look to ourselves and say, look, it is because of our own weakness, of our own negligence, of our own forgetfulness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed this to occur to the Muslim ummah. And in fact, in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ said, it will be soon that the ummah, the other nations will come and attack you or come to you like the one who is eating food comes to his plate. And when the Sahaba when the Sahabi asked him, is it at that time, is this because we're going to be a small number? And that's why they're going to easily come and just attack us like someone eating from a plate? The Prophet ﷺ will tell him, no, it's not because of your small number. But you will become like the froth on the sea. Now we talk so much about we are 1 billion Muslims. But we are, as the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ describes us, and we are like the froth on the sea. We are just being pushed around, have no strength of our own. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will remove the awe from the hearts of your enemies. And will put in your hearts, al-wahn. And when the Prophet ﷺ was asked, what is this al-wahn? The Prophet ﷺ said, حُبُّ الدُّنْيَا وَكَرَاهِيَةِ الْمَوْتِ. The love of this dunya and hatred for death. The love of this dunya and hatred for death. When the Muslims begin to just love this dunya and their purpose in their life is for this dunya, and they fear death, they fear giving up and sacrificing for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows the other the other nations to come to us and to attack us or to devour us, like being called to like people being called to a dinner, so to speak. In particular, if you study, for example, in the last century, if you study what has been the West's attitude towards Islam, first of all. And that's where we have to start with, by the way. We have to start with the West's attitude towards Islam. It has been clear from many years ago that the West has recognized that Islam is really a threat to them. This first was expressed clearly by the West themselves. You can trace it back even before much of the Islamic movement existed. That they recognize that a threat to them is in fact the West. Richard Nixon, for example. Richard Nixon, who was president, when was he president? 68 to 72, at least, right? He's the one who took us out of Vietnam, right? It's amazing how history can be changed so easily, Nixon was this great anti-war hero. Nixon said that Islam is going to become a geopolitical force and such a danger to the West that the West will be forced to cooperate with Moscow to face this opposition in the Islamic world. the West is going to be forced to cooperate with Russia, the Soviets, the communists, the socialists, whatever you want to call them. They were not really communists, they weren't anything. There's a story of a joke of, or actually it's a story in Belgrade. You know, Belgrade, after the fall of socialism or communism, somebody wrote on a wall, "Bring us back socialism," because, you know, life was miserable when capitalism entered. So someone wrote on the wall, "Bring us back socialism." And somebody else wrote before it, "We never had socialism." And so the first guy went back, "Bring us back what we had before." So here Richard Nixon is saying our arch enemy. If you know Richard Nixon, he was one of those big anti-communists, you know, just like he was like a pre-Reagan Reagan. He's saying we're going to have to work with Moscow to fight this Islamic force. And that Islam and West are opposites, and the West has to be ready to meet this Islamic challenge. And actually, when you look at what has happened since the fall of the Soviet Union, they are in fact working together to fight Islam. Margaret Thatcher, you all remember Margaret Thatcher, someone who was quoted by someone, by the way, as showing that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ must not be an authentic hadith that says that people will not prosper if their leader is a ruler, and the person pointed to Margaret Thatcher of all people. Anyway, after the fall of the Soviets, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Basically, NATO was a response to the Warsaw Pact. NATO was a response to the Socialist Pact to defend the West against the socialists. So after the fall of socialism, NATO had no purpose, really. They had to look for a purpose to continue to exist. And Margaret Thatcher gave them the purpose. She said that NATO must be preserved in order to face the Islamic danger. And one of the CIO officials during the Reagan years, he was talking about, while working in Reagan, he said there was a genuine visceral fear of Islam in Washington as a force that was utterly alien to American thinking, and that really scared us. Senior people at the Pentagon and elsewhere were much more concerned about Islam than communism. This was during the Reagan years. They were much more concerned about Islam than communism. It was almost obsessive fear, leading to a mentality on our part that you should use any stick to beat a dog to stop the advance of Islamic fundamentalism. So what he's saying here is that they should use any force whatsoever that they have to stop Islamic fundamentalism. Didn't even say Islamic extremism. He said Islamic fundamentalism. Use any stick that you can use to stop Islamic fundamentalism. And when we discuss the current situation, and especially when the kuffar come to us and discuss the current situation, why do they hate us? Remember all that talk, why do they hate us? Why do you also, what is the real purpose behind your hatred for Islam and the Muslim world? Why during the Reagan years that you have such a fear of Islam that that one of the CIA officials could describe it as saying you should use any stick to beat the dog? Before you even ask why do they hate us, talking about the Muslims hating America, the first question is why does America take this stance towards Islam from the beginning? What was the rational stance that you, or the rationale behind the stance that you've taken? And the steps that you have implemented, which are clearly going to result in violent interaction between the two civilizations. Why do you also, what is the real purpose behind your hatred for Islam and the Muslim world? Why during the Reagan years that you have such a fear of Islam that that one of the CIA officials could describe it as saying you should use any stick to beat the dog. Before you even ask why do they hate us, talking about the Muslims hating America, the first question is why does America take this stance towards Islam from the beginning? What was the rational stance that you, or the rationale behind the stance that you've taken? And the steps that you have implemented, which are clearly going to result in violent interaction between the two civilizations. Oh, and of course we can't forget Israel's role in all of this and also in propagating this kind of fear among the Americans. Israel, at one time, it had a very important role in the Middle East, and that was to destroy and to fight the kind of Arab nationalism that was growing and developing in that area. But now its major role is to help in the fighting against Islamic fundamentalism. And in fact, Ishaq Rabin, he said that Islamic fundamentalism is spreading out of the Middle East. The world must follow Israel's role in fighting this movement.